Welcome to the Pit Rivers. This is Witch Bottle Live, and today we'll be unpacking what it means to have a witch bottle, what they mean, where they come from, who makes them, and we're going to be unpacking it with this brilliant team of experts who've got an AHRC project running currently at the moment, all about witch bottles. Now, a bit of a disclaimer. I know some of you have been very worried on social media about emptying the witch bottle and whether it's going to be uncorked for the very first time and will we unleash hell? Well, the answer is no, because the witch bottle that we're looking at today has already been opened and the contents has already been looked at. But this is the first time that it's going to be looked at by a team of experts as part of this project. So Nigel, can you actually tell me about your project? What are you doing with these bottles?
Well, thanks, Raksha. Yeah, we're on a 3-year project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which has allowed us to bring together experts from MOLA, so that's myself, Nigel Jeffries, Michael Marshall, and from the University of Hertfordshire, Kerry Holbrook, and Professor Owen Davis. And we're looking at really trying to sort of get a sense of recalibrating our understanding of the witch bottle practice at its very origins in this country, in England, in the mid to late 17th century. And we're doing that by exploring all facets of the practice. That is, from looking at the chronology of the types of bottles which were used as containers for witch bottles, as well as looking at the places in which they are found, as well as looking at the most important part, which of course is the contents, and that's what makes them a witch bottle, as well as looking at the historical and textual evidence which survives in various accounts of the creation of these bottles, or indeed in recipe books from the time as well, hence the inclusion of my great colleagues, Owen and Kerry.
So that's the other thing as well, is you've been asking people, haven't you? How do you have a witch bottle? And you had a bit of a call to arms, didn't you?
Absolutely.
A few months ago, asking people if they'd actually found witch bottles.
Yeah. I mean, a really important part of it is getting the sense of what this is as a national collection. Bring it together for the first time as a national collection. And so to do this, to enable this, when we first launched the project in 2019, that's when our funding started for it, is that we used the hashtag WitchBottleLive. Sorry, that's the hashtag we're using at the moment, sorry. Witch Bottle Hunt, too many hashtags in my head there. And Witch Bottle Hunt, which we posted out as a call out on social media on my workplace, Museum of London Archaeology's Twitter page. Failing that, people can use that as a hashtag to report their findings. Otherwise, they can just simply email me, that's fine as well.
So they can look on the mola.org page. Please send us your questions right now as well. We're looking at using hashtag WitchBottleLive. So if you've got any questions, if you think you've got one, please send them through at the moment. That would be great. So Faye, you work at the Pit Rivers. You're a curator here. Is that right?
Yes, I am. So I'm the deputy head of collections at the Pit Rivers Museum.
And what about the collection here? It's amazing.
Yeah, so the collection, or the museum, was founded in 1884 with the personal collection of Augustus Henry Lane Fox, Pit Rivers.
That is a mouthful.
It is a bit of a mouthful. So he was a general in the British Army, but he had a big personal kind of fortune and wealth, and he was also an antiquarian, so he collected archaeology, ethnographic objects, natural history specimens, all sorts of things really. He was also actually an archaeologist himself, so was responsible for excavating a lot of where he lived down in kind of Dorset and Somerset, and so he had this big personal collection of around 25,000 objects, which he wanted to house in a museum. So he approached the University of Oxford, and they took his collection, built a museum for it after his name. He soon kind of lost interest in his collection at Oxford and went on to collect further and make his own museum down in Farnham and Dorset. But since then, after 1884, the collections were added to. So today we've got around 500,000 things, and were largely collected and added to by the first curator of the museum, Henry Balfour, who found this jug, donated this bottle in 1893, and also was responsible, I think, for acquiring this bottle from Warren, Edward Warren, in 1910. And I think Warren and Balfour would have mixed in the same circles as the Pit Rivers. at the Society of Antiquities, the Folklore Society. Warren presented this bottle at a meeting of the Society of Antiquities, which I'm pretty sure Balfour would have been at as a kind of show and tell, and then offered it to the museum. There's a lovely correspondence between Balfour and Warren. Warren saying, it would be my absolute pleasure for me to come and show you this bottle and give it to you, send it to you so you could have it for the museum. So, and I think they're here really in Oxford because of their association with witchcraft, magic, sympathetic magic, folklore, more than anything else, because we have a really big collection. Focusing on that area.
Right, so I'm a bit confused because I thought we were looking at one bottle today, but now we have two. So which one are we going to look at the contents of?
So we're going to empty the 1893 bottle from Norwich. So the bottle from London, the 1910 bottle, has already been emptied.
Oh, right, and the contents are in that box?
They're in the box here.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it's quite lovely. There's like a heart with pins in it. Is that a bit of cork there?
Yeah.
And some human hair.
Absolutely, yeah. So there's a bit of cloth that's being cut to the shape of a heart and kind of pierced with pins, and then a bit of cork, a bit of human hair that were all placed inside this bottle. Then the bottle, this bottle was excavated by Warren in London, in Westminster, and this bottle has stuff in it. We do know exactly it has been emptied before, but we haven't really analysed or properly looked at the contents of this box of this bottle in relation to kind of what it means. Is it similar to these? And I'm sure my colleagues will explain. There's lots of different things that go into these bottles. So yeah.
And are these the records of when these bottles actually arrived at the Pitt Rivers as well?
Yeah. So when they arrived in 1910, they were added into the accession book. So recording here what Warren knew about the bottles, and Warren himself refers to it as a witch bottle. So he kind of knew what he was collecting, and the index card, which interestingly, so the index cards, which you can see behind us, are arranged by geographical region and type. So this whole set of index cards are charms, amulets, and witchcraft. So all objects pertaining to that.
So Nigel, but what are these bottles? What are witch bottles?
Okay, witch bottles are containers of prepared cures against bewitchment. What you're looking at really, and what the project is looking at, is the beginning of bottle magic in this country in the mid to late 17th century. Bewitchment and responses to bewitchment have a lot more resonance going back in time, and normally have herbal remedies associated with them. But at some point, for whatever reason, in the mid to late 17th century, bottle magic becomes one of the procedures which can be used, a curative procedure which can be used against witchcraft. The bottles themselves, however, and this is a frequent association, are not actually made as witch bottles. They are reused as witch bottles.
Right, so these bottles, that people look at them and they go, right, I've got a witch bottle.
Correct.
They're not witch bottles.
Correct. And
who makes them?
And it's a frequent, something I see often in museum collections or on social media, someone even in some museum catalogues and, and displays, there is the association somehow which is made between these bottles being witch bottles, and that is not the case. In terms of answering your question, Raksha, these bottles are made in Germany. They are stoneware, impervious, highly fired, and they are made in their tens of thousands in the period from about 1550 to 1700 in production centres just situated outside of Frechen, which is near the city of Cologne. They were then shipped up the Rhineland and then, taken by Dutch ships from the Dutch ports, redistributed widely, even, sorry, to
I quite like wildly though.
to locations across the globe. I think of them as the Coke can of the day. They are shipped, however, empty. They do not necessarily have their contents in them necessarily, and they would there to hold any form of liquid. Dutch genre paintings of the late 17th century, of course, show them principally used for containing alcoholic beverages. But shipwrecks show that they would also be shipped out to the East Indies containing mercury, for example. So they have a sort of medical, scientific kind of use as well, just because of what they are. And what the great feature of these bottles, themselves, of course, is the application of the face mask.
Well, it's quite a jolly bearded man, isn't there?
It is, and the Germans refer to them as Bartman, which literally is the translation as bearded man. And they often would also have these medallions applied to them as well. The example from London, from Westminster, which we're viewing here on the right, has the coat of arms of the electors of the 7 electors of the Holy Roman Empire, whereas this one here on our left, which is the Norwich Bottle, which we're going to be opening presently, has this sort of petal rosette. So the most important thing to sort of stress here about them is the fact that actually these bottles are not witch bottles; they become witch bottles. They are reused as witch bottles at the point when the various contents are added to them. Now, principally, these don't always survive in museum collections. So we know from the textual evidence, for example, that they could be urine, it could be salt, it could be mercury, crops up a few times as well. But principally what is always added to them, this is the sort of the concurrent theme, is the addition of iron objects, such as nails and pins, and indeed, on occasion, felt hearts like you're seeing here.
Gosh, so really they are what I could presume as the Tupperware of its day. They were just produced, they were sent out, especially during times of empire, to different parts of the globe. And it's only the process by putting the objects in that it suddenly becomes a witch bottle.
Yeah, the addition of the contents is what makes them the witch bottles, what makes them witch bottles. And of course, witch bottles as practice is something which is practiced today across the globe, and also is still practiced. If you look on YouTube, any form of social media, you will see people recreating and remaking witch bottles.
So do you also get witch bottles that aren't these vessels as well?
From time to time, yes. There's not always a clear association. Whilst it's absolutely clear that in the mid to late 17th century, such was the ubiquity of these bottles in circulation in England at the time, and so widely traded, that these clearly are the preferred choices, and we'll be coming on to perhaps exploring reasons why that is. The fact that obviously one part of the ritual or the creation of these bottles means that they have to be heated. These are particularly well suited to being heated. Okay, but there are other examples of the practice dated to the mid to late 17th century, which are found where they're using earthenware vessels as well. Yes.
Well, I'm really looking forward to looking at the contents of that one, really. So. Faye, could you do the honours, please?
Sure. So I'm going to the Norwich Bottle. I'm from 1893. I'm going to tip it out, and hopefully the contents will nicely fall onto this pre-prepared tray. So I should just say before I do that, with a museum artefact, ordinarily would maybe use something like an endoscope, or something kind of non-destructive. We wouldn't really want to upset or disturb the artefact. If it came into the museum, we want to preserve it as is. The fact that this has already been unstoppered and it's been emptied in the past means that that's okay for us to do today.
Sure.
So here goes.
Gosh, there is something inside there, isn't there? Well, lots of detritus, and I can definitely see some pins and nails, and I love it how the research team are craning their necks now.
I'm having to kind of shake it a bit because, there's the bigger bits that I think was getting kind of a bit stuck and coming out. And I can still hear that there's still some...
There's loads of stuff in there.
Presumably quite hard, therefore, to have put it in the first place.
Absolutely. So I might actually... no, there's...
Wow.
There it is.
There's a big old bent nail there coming out.
You know what? I think that there is one more thing. I'm just going to use the torch to see what's causing it to not come out, really. Okay. Another bit of metal in there, so it's not really...
It will eventually come out, I'm sure.
Wanting to...
At least we don't have animals as well.
There we go. Okay. That is it. I'm pretty sure that is it. Okay. I'll let
Okay, so
come in.
Michael, you've been
Explore that.
looking at the contents, haven't you, of these bottles? So you've been visiting lots of museums and their archives. You've been going and looking at all of these witch bottles in museum collections, and you've been looking at the insides of them. Would you say that this is typical of what they've been finding?
Yeah, we've visited museums all over Eastern England, really, to try and look at these rare examples where the contents still survive. Because quite often there's older records that say, we found a witch bottle and there was some iron in it. But what part of the project, what we're trying to do is really sort of get at the detail of the act, what they choose to put inside, and the whole process of that, really. And so, just having a quick initial look at what we've got here. Well, for a start, most of these things are made out of iron, and that is a kind of common theme. Nails are almost ubiquitous where we have surviving contents, and that might be because they are kind of cheap and widely available, like the bottles themselves, or it might be because of their particular characteristics, because they're sharp and pointy. Because the other thing that's fairly ubiquitous, what I'm separating out here at the moment, is the fact that you do tend to find copper alloy pins, normally brass pins made out of wire, which again are...
So are those pins, they're like dressmakers' pins, aren't they?
Yeah, basically they're used for a range of kind of textile working and dress purposes. So certain people today would have been bristling with them. They're very cheap. They're things that you'd have in most households. So these aren't sort of rarefied magical materials. These are sort of common objects. And as we've looked at the contents of these bottles, we've quite often found sort of evidence that the bits of iron, for example, are sort of reused bits of scrap and things like that. Rivets from objects that have already been used and broken down, recycled bits of things.
Those larger bits of iron, I'm presuming that they're iron.
Yeah, absolutely.
They kind of look almost like roof tile nails, don't they?
Yeah,
it's funny how they're all bent as well, and they're kind of misshapen, and they've been like squished together. Yeah,
so some of these are from nails. I think we've got the cross-section of an iron blade here from a little iron knife.
Oh, right, so that there's like the end that would have gone into the handle there, isn't there?
Yeah, exactly. And a couple of these are from staples or joiner's dogs, which are fittings to keep wood together. What we don't obviously have here are some of the sort of organic elements, things like the cloth heart that we had in the London bottle, or the hair and the nails, and of course, as a really important element of the stuff that goes into these, which we know about from the written sources, is urine, which we can perhaps pick up using scientific analysis, but doesn't tend to survive in museum collections.
It's probably for the best, though, isn't it?
Yes, it would be less pleasant looking through this stuff.
I mean, I don't know what I was expecting, but I was kind of hoping for clumps of hair to come out and nail clippings, but I'm surprised there's so much dirt in there.
Yeah, well, some of this is iron oxide, so it's rust from the iron objects. Some of this might be dirt, and now that we've emptied out this bottle, we'll be able to take a closer look at that, really. And we are really looking at these objects in detail, because one of the things that we're really interested in is how they're treating these objects. There are sort of recurrent patterns in terms of things being deliberately bent or broken. It's perhaps part of the ritual, looking at exactly what objects people choose to include, whether they always use the same numbers, and just trying to define what the different sort of variables within the ritual practice is, and see if there's any sort of geographical or temporal patterning.
But I'm also guessing that if we were doing this with an intact vessel with the contents in it, we would treat it very much in an archaeological way, wouldn't we? Where, similar way that we would treat cremation burial, where we would be very careful in recovering it, maybe x-raying it to see if there's like a way in which things were deposited inside it. I mean, the fact that this has already been opened and been knocked around is another thing, really.
Absolutely, it completely affects how we approach this, really. So if it's an undisturbed bottle, it that someone, say, finds in their house, it's a really good idea to get in touch with archaeologists before you go any further, because there's all sorts of information that you can capture about the orientation of the bottle, about perhaps the order that the objects went into the bottle, and we can do, as you say, things like X-raying or using an endoscope, as Faye was saying, to have a look inside. We do various types of scientific sampling as well. So, all of these different elements help build up a really detailed picture of the sort of series of choices that are getting made every time someone's compiling one of these witch bottles, and the different ingredients and the different order of things.
So, Kerry, the order, that's what I want to know. I mean, what makes this a witch bottle? How do you put one together?
I mean, we'd love to know that the order that things were going into them. I think really to understand the witch bottle, it's to understand why it was being made to begin with. So it would be a case of somebody who was suffering from a certain disease or certain misfortunes, or perhaps an animal, a horse, a cow, was suffering, and the fear was that they were bewitched. So a witch had cursed them. Whether they knew who that witch was or not, in most cases they didn't. They were worried that they were bewitched. So they would go to a cunning person, who I'm sure Owen can tell us more about in a moment, and they would be prescribed making one of these witch bottles. And it is really important to see it as kind of a medical magic. So it's not just purely magic. These aren't curses. These were kind of medically prescribed to counteract a witch's curse, or to stop the witch from cursing.
So if something was going wrong in your life, I don't know, maybe somebody was ill, or as you said, your animal had gone dead or your crops failed, you would go and see somebody.
Yep. So you'd go and see a cunning person, and they would prescribe one of these bottles. And really the thinking behind these bottles is sympathetic magic, which kind of underpin a lot of...
What does that mean? What is sympathetic magic?
It's a hard concept to explain, but really it is the belief that you could impact one thing based on its close relationship to something else. So for instance, you could take a personal item, so something that's been worn close to the body maybe, and you could separate it from the person, so take it away. But what you did to that object would influence the person as well. So you could damage the object and it would harm the person.
So it's a bit like, I don't know, what we would use now as a good luck charm, perhaps.
Yeah. So it's all about creating a link between yourself and the bottle. So the victim, the person who believes that they're bewitched, makes a connection by putting certain items into the bottle. So we've already mentioned urine being a key ingredient. So the victim would place their urine inside it, and that creates a connection between themselves and the bottle, but also with the witch, the suspected witch, because through cursing, the witch is already connected to the victim. So it becomes kind of like a triangle of connection. So you have the bottle containing the urine and other items, which is connected to the victim, who is connected to the witch. So what happens to the bottle also impacts the witch. So having the urine suggests that maybe the connection was specifically to the witch's bladder, or maybe to the heart. Perhaps that's where we're getting the cloth heart. And by putting these objects in, so these sharp metallic objects, imagine that they're going into kind of the witch's bladder and the amount of pain that it's causing. So these are meant to be kind of objects of torment, really. So you're getting kind of needles, nails, pins, but you're also getting thorns, glass fragments, so anything that's sharp, that will cause the witch enough pain that they will be identified, and they will lift the curse, or they may die, and then the curse will be lifted. So yeah, it's all about establishing that connection, and that's why you're seeing hair and nail pairings there as well, because these are kind of objects from the body, and that's strengthening that link.
Oh, right. So the witch has bewitched you. It's something that's personal to you, so you have to put something personal about your own person into there to try and then counter-curse that.
Yeah.
Wow, that's very complicated. And we've actually got a few questions, So one is, how common are witch bottles?
Yeah, it's really, 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 really good question. The short answer is not very, okay? To date, we've found 146 examples of the mid to late 17th century practice these containers, okay? Not only that, they are very, very specifically geographically located in England. Okay, so this is where the practice of bottle magic begins.
Right, so it's not Britain-wide then?
It becomes British-wide later in the 19th century, but by then, the notion of the witch bottle has got mixed up with all sorts of different things. So it's not the same as what we're looking at here, okay? It's very different, very different. So where we've found them, you know, for example, is that they're very, very much located in the eastern counties of England, okay? So that is principally Suffolk, Norfolk, Cambridgeshire, quite a few examples from London, Kent, and then really it then sort of extends in the sort of range of 3 to 4 to 5 in places like East and West Sussex and Hampshire, where most of the evidence is, well, all of the evidence from Hampshire, for example, is one village alone.
Gosh,
From an
something bad must have been happening
from
there.
And the interesting thing is as well is that whilst most witch bottles have been, have been found from renovations of what are now historic buildings, okay? And there's little question that most witch bottles were found from the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. And almost all the examples from Suffolk, for example, were found from between the 1950s, 60s and 70s, and it seems as though that none have been found since. So it's very kind of geographically determinate, but that's determined on the fact that these are prescribed cures and remedies, and that you're not looking at something which is kind of well known to everybody, okay? Because let's face it, the fear of witches, of bewitchment, of being cursed, whatever these kind of quite loaded terms we're using here, has something which resonates across the continent and it resonates across the British Isles. So witch bottles are something which are very peculiar to England for a very short period of time. Say, using these Bartman jugs as the containers. And what happens in the mid to by the time you get to the early 18th century, there isn't much evidence of them anymore. And then it picks up again in the 19th century, but it's kind of mixed up with lots of other things by that point.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? I think on social media, we've been getting some really interesting traction, especially when we said that we were having this event, this whole kind of idea of being extremely superstitious. I mean, do you see that this whole kind of superstition just kind of travels through the ages? You can't unleash, another pandemic on us. If you open this, we're going to be cursed. Do you get this, that we're bought into this psyche?
There is always going to be fear of the unknown, fear of something that we don't understand, and fear of something that we can't control. I might have been a little bit, if this hadn't already been opened previously, because I do understand that there's a lot of beliefs went into the making of these bottles, and there are still a lot of beliefs out there about making kind of contemporary witch bottles. So kind of fear and anxiety is completely understandable, and it does, it's timeless really. So yeah, absolutely.
And what about you, Michael? Because normally you're a Romanist, aren't you? So what are you doing here? I mean, but for me, as an archaeologist, I can see this kind of continuation of the bending metal in like a ritual purpose. It reminds me of, lead curse tablets in Roman bath, or, around hidden lead rolls in monasteries. Do you think the same thing?
Well, I don't think that necessarily the meaning's identical, but there are these sorts of common threads in terms of objects that get used in kind of magical processes and sacrificial processes and things like that, through the centuries. So, some of these ideas that we're talking about things being deliberately bent and destroyed, I mean, that could be a way of sort of moving things from the mundane into the sort of the world of magic and the sort of spiritual sides of things, a way of kind of sacrificing things, using things up as a part of an ingredient, the sort of materia magica of compiling these witch bottles. I think the really nice things about where we do have the surviving contents is that by looking at material closely, we can try and reconstruct the exact sort of series of decisions and processes that go into it. So for example, the pins, sometimes they're found straight, sometimes they're found bent in very specific ways, either bent once or kind of Z-shaped bends. And are these bits of information about how individual people, like individual types of knowledge about how to compile these witch bottles, what can these little variations in how people are putting them all together tell us, really?
And there's some records for there's some witch bottles from Hellington in Norfolk. I wonder about whether or not sort of efficacy or strength kind of mattered, because there's some witch bottles which have bonkers contents in them. So whilst they may well have nails.
Define bonkers contents.
Bonkers contents. One, for example, is one from Hellington in Norfolk, which I think has sort of parts of either a Dutch or French Bible manuscript sort of cut up and sort of added into it.
You really don't associate witchcraft and magic with the use of the Bible.
Yeah, it's magical. The term we like to use is magical medical, for example, and that's how we need to sort of think and situate these objects. So, what Michael's talking about in terms of, sort of understanding the trends and understanding, the different contents. Some of them, for example, contain, bits of the body, which is what Kerry was talking about as important for sympathetic magic. Principally nails and hair as well, but a lot of them don't. And then there's others which as I said, have these sort of bonkers contents. But the main thing that does connect them, just to build on what my colleagues were saying, is the use of nails. And that's something which runs through witch bottles of the 17th century to ones of the 19th century to ones of the 20th century. That seems to be the sort of common thread. So that's really interesting, I think, as well. Yeah.
Right, so Owen, I've made my witch bottle. I've put my bodily parts into it. I've had a good wee into it. Bent some nails and pins. Then what?
Two options, and all this would have been advised by a specialist. We've already heard mention of a cunning person, cunning man, cunning woman. The majority were men at this period, but there were a significant minority of cunning women as well. And these were the people who were advising this. So people weren't learning themselves how to construct a witch bottle.
Oh, right. So they weren't doing it themselves. They were going. They were getting expert help.
A specialist in unbewitching, a specialist in dealing with witches, and these people were called cunning folk. And that's why it's a bit of a misnomer in one sense to call these witch bottles, because they're not called that at the time. There is not one reference in the late 17th or early 18th century where these they're always referred to as a bottle, an earthen bottle, which you then put the contents in. First time we get the term witch bottle to describe these is actually in the 1840s in a museum collection. So yeah, we have to be a bit careful. But it's cunning folk who are doing these. They're the ones who are either doing the ritual on behalf of a client, or they're instructing the client quite in detailed ways about what they're meant to do.
So who are these cunning folk?
Well, we have to remember at this time, late 17th century, there's still laws against witches. Although the trials themselves have really wound down, the last person to be executed for witchcraft is in the 1680s, so it's just in the time when these are being used. But we have to remember that people who were prosecuted for being suspected witches, who are tried for them, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole raft of daily rituals and procedures against witches. So if you fear you're bewitched, you might go to the magistrate and see if you can get them prosecuted, but it costs time, it costs money. Magic can be much cheaper, popular magic. And so you might not go to the law, you'll go to a cunning person who will then advise to do this. And for example, the iron objects we see there, the nails are there because they're sharp, as Kerry said. But they're also there because iron is a really, really important anti-witch charm in this period. And particularly old iron, you get references in the 16th century to saying, pick up a bit of old iron and that will really help you. Put it in your house, put it up by the door, like a horseshoe. Horseshoe is a potent anti-witch charm because of the iron, essentially, at this time. So there's a knowledge between all of these, and cunning folk are the people who seem to have all that knowledge. And so when you went to them and said you were bewitched, and a number of cunning folk were offering this service. Only a few, as we know, it's geographical, and that's probably down to a handful maybe of cunning folk doing this sort of practice, and clients coming to them from up to 30, 40 miles away or whatever, or travelling by barge or whatever around the coast.
They sound like dodgy salesmen to me.
Yeah, some of them are clearly quite unsavoury characters. Some of them aren't. There's a whole spectrum. What they are is entrepreneurial. And so when we talk about, Nigel's talking about bonkers content, that's because they're making it up. There's the essentials, and then they add their own touch. You come to me. So felt hearts, there's only a handful of those. I'm pretty sure it's just one cunning person who that's their signature witch bottle, so to speak, at this time. But once you've gone to them and they've advised it, there's two ways in which the bottle is used once all the contents are in. One way is you put it on the fire and you boil it, and that's what really gets all the contents agitated. That's the sympathetic magic that Kerry's talking about, and that's what it's meant to harm the bladder of the witch or the heart. Because it's mostly, of course, most of those accused of witchcraft were women. she would then come to the door and reveal herself and say, take it off, stop, 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 I will take off the spell. So it's partly identifying the witch, and it's partly about, causing so much pain to her, as she's caused pain to you, that she desists. And as part of that, what would happen, you'd boil and boil and boil, and maybe the cork would pop out, and that would be the end of the ritual. It's done. Occasionally, they would explode. And this
No
could be quite
thanks.
serious. Yeah, exactly. Exploding nails and urine flying at you. And indeed, we have one case from the early 18th century where one of these earthenware witch bottles, I think it was a bigger flagon to do with bewitched cows, exploded and basically took a man's face off.
Oh, ow.
They could destroy
Awful.
half a building if one of these just went, because it's like a bit like a grenade almost, the pressure in it. So it's quite dangerous doing that ritual. But the reason these survive is the second one, which is actually to bury it. And that's why there's no burn marks on these at all. These were buried, and that's kind of the more long-term protection against the suspected witch, to make sure that there's always this there, that if she causes any harm, it's constantly rumbling away there. There's the nails in this, even if it's not being boiled at this period. And that's why we find these. We don't find ones which have been, we wouldn't know, as archaeologists find it difficult to sift through fragments of a Bartman jug to say, oh, this is an exploded witch bottle. So, there's the unknown there in terms of that type of ritual.
So this whole idea of concealing a bottle, that's all part of it as well then?
Yeah, the concealment is one, I think in essence is about, you're basically providing a barrier from you don't want the accused witch, suspected witch, getting hold of the bottle, because she would then be back in control of that relationship. And then she could potentially use the contents in it through symptomatic magic to cause more harm again as well. But this is just one ritual of many, many anti-witchcraft charms and spells. As I say, iron was used widely.
It's really interesting that this whole theme of metal, it seems to run through the ages. I always think that, creating metal itself is a magical process, isn't it? Do you think that's why people use metal?
It's really difficult. I mean, one of the early folklorists in the late 19th century thought it was because this was a kind of an echo of the first people doing metalwork, and the aura of the blacksmith and the aura and speciality and mysteriousness of making metal down the ages had somehow been translated into this being anti-witch. It's also anti-fairy as well, iron as well. It's a nice theory, but again, it's one of the things, there's no evidence for it. And you could say, okay, well, why not copper, which came before the Iron Age? Why isn't copper considered to have these properties? So I don't know. It is a mystery. I mean, in Ireland in the 18th century, it was considered because St. Patrick had blessed iron, and therefore that it had all these properties. But that's just one specific tradition. So it is part of the mystery still about the origins of iron as an anti-witchcraft element.
I think we've got tons of questions, tons and tons. Right. So somebody's already asked, can they be X-rayed to find out what's inside before opening them? I suppose.
Yeah, they could be X-rayed. You can use XRF, so fluorescence, and by X-raying them, you'd see the contents before having to empty them out like this. And with an X-ray, you would identify, I suppose, the bigger bits of metal and even the smaller bits of pin, I guess. And then I suppose there are scientific methods. So again, the XRF would tell you if you wanted to identify exactly that it definitely is iron, it's an alloy, it's a brass, what metal it is, and if there's any organic matter in it. So yeah, X-ray would be a good idea. Yeah.
Would the fact that iron is magnetic be significant?
Possibly. All I can say is when you look at the earliest published references to iron in the 16th, 17th centuries as iron as a witchcraft, they don't talk about. It's not mentioned at all in the sources, put it that way. Doesn't mean that isn't part of the reason, but it's not mentioned.
The part of the charm of including iron.
Yeah.
Right, okay. All right, so why do we call them bellarmines?
Well, this is my thing. Bellarmine is Bellarmine is something which is they're named after Cardinal Bellarmine, okay, who was a late, I'm going to get my chronology wrong here. He was, I think, a 16th century Italian cardinal who was particularly against Protestants. However, the association of Cardinal Bellarmine with these jugs, because you're right, they're normally called bellarmines, and that's because when they first start getting reported and recorded and start entering museum collections in the 19th century, there was a knowledge that these things had been called bellarmine jugs, and you find them referred to in I think there's a few plays from the 17th century where they're called bellarmine jugs, and that's because of the association with it's not really association with the face, but it's because it's the English, what's the word for it? Perhaps almost during this period, obsession with Catholicism. And so because Cardinal Bellarmine was a kind of, anti-Protestant, because, he was also sort of, associated with that anti sort of drinking and sort of, all those kind of more northern European cultural traits, the English named these jugs Bellarmine jugs. And that's represented, as I said, in other contemporary literature of the 17th century. So that's why. And the name's just stuck. It's stuck in kind of, the ways in when they're first found and reported and they first start getting entered into museum collections in the 19th century. They're often called Bellarmine jugs.
And it doesn't, the face doesn't look like Cardinal Bellarmine.
Yeah, it doesn't look like Cardinal Bellarmine has got, the chronology is all wrong as well. And the Germans and nobody else in Europe refers to them as Bellarmine jugs. It's just a peculiarly English practice of the 17th century, just like witch bottles are, in fact.
So we should really refer to them as Bartman jugs.
Bartman is the German, bearded man. Indeed, that's what they
Interesting.
stand for, yeah.
Oh, somebody would like to see the felt heart and they'd like to see the items.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very interesting. Michael or, Faye, you could.
Oh, there you go.
You had a good look at them, didn't you, Michael?
So we have actually got an archival reference to someone putting a heart in under the recommendation of a Cunning folk in 1670. So we do actually have an archival reference to that practice.
I mean, I'll take a photo of them as well. So that'll be up on social media, so you can have a look at those as well closely. So, this is interesting. Have any been found in Essex? Apparently, the last Cunning man was based in Essex.
Correct. That would be Cunning Mural.
Yeah, it's not true the last one.
Yeah.
The last maybe notorious or famous one.
Yeah,
Cunning Mural. Yeah, he was quite well.
Do we have a story?
There is a story about Cunning Mural, in fact, as it happens, because he actually practiced and experimented with, and there were a couple of Cunning folk in the 19th century experimented with iron witch bottles, reusables. They thought they're entrepreneurial.
Iron again.
They're entrepreneurial. They thought, so they got a blacksmith to create, and Mural did this as well, got a blacksmith to create iron bottles that they could reuse. So you would do the boiling ritual, the cork would pop out, cunning person with, like Cunning Mural, would take the bottle back again. Problem was, in the both two occasions that we have references to this, the iron bottle exploded under the pressure. Now you can imagine an iron bottle filled with obviously urine, exploding. It was even worse than one of those earthenware bottles. And we actually have the records of, in the late 1790s, of a cunning person instructing an iron bottle for a client who then did it. It exploded and tore half his house apart and killed him. And we have the records, and we even have his burial details. So dangerous stuff. And Cunning Mural also did that, and it took half a cottage with it.
Yeah, that's right.
With him as well.
I believe all of Cunning Mural's archive, as such as it exists, is in Southend Museum. I believe. Yeah.
Sounds like loads of shrapnel going.
Yeah, shrapnel was like a hand grenade. Yeah, it'd be like a hand grenade coming off, the splinters everywhere. It was absolute.
But he was obviously well known
scene.
Because he's in the records.
Yeah. Newspapers reported on this.
Yeah.
On his activities. When he turned up in a village to deal with a witch, hundreds would turn out and see what he was going to do.
Yeah.
Wow.
So these people are still circulating in society up until the 19th century, and still practicing a form of witch bottle, which is kind of taking its roots and its knowledge from the mid to late 17th century ones we've got here. I mean, the interesting thing is also about the kind of records is that there's court record from the Old Bailey which talks about boiling urine and nails in a pipkin, which is like a kind of three-footed tripod vessel, earthenware vessel. There are other examples from the 1580s and from the 1640s which talk about boiling urine in pans and nails in pans. But the whole point is that these things do not survive or have not survived, or archaeologists have not been looking for, old bits of pans with bits of fused nails on them. So consequently, the focus has always been on the survival of the Bartman jug and its association as being a witch bottle. So they're almost like, what's the word I'm kind of looking for here? Perhaps they've been sort of slightly kind of raised above the parapet a little bit more than perhaps they actually were. In fact, there's a whole range of other vessels that we know could have been used for them. And bottle magic, as I said, it seems to begin about the 1670s, 80s, and that corresponds with the first written records as well. The dates of the bottles seem to date from this period as well. But before that, there's records of people essentially carrying out what you might include as being the contents of a witch bottle much earlier, but in like saucepans and pipkins and things like that.
So would you say it's easy to say that what we're looking at here is negative evidence?
Yeah.
These are the things that survive.
Yep.
But actually the practice was much
indeed.
more widely used.
And just part of the, medical, magical responses which people were using for bewitchment. It wasn't just you could do a witch bottle. You look at the records of Nicholas Culpeper, for example, he talks about using, again, quicksilver, silver mercury, and putting it in a quill or a pen and burying it just outside your house. So they're part of something much bigger, which, because historians and archaeologists haven't necessarily been sort of talking to each other, and certainly when these bottles were first raised, their profile was by an archaeologist and museum in London curator called Ralph Merrifield. He was writing in the 1950s, and at that sort of particular point, there wasn't that kind of sort of multidisciplinary culture perhaps we now have within the humanities to do this sort of work, and there wasn't the the online searches you could do on digitized newspapers and accounts from the period in which you could search for all the different records. Really,
it is to follow on from your point about negative evidence. Archaeologists identify these, or owners identify them, because they're ones that are found in buildings, where in fact that one there was in fact found in a mill dam bank in London. There's other ones which have been found in the banks of rivers. Well, there's a literary evidence of a cunning advising putting it in a dung heap. So the ones that we identify is because they're in houses. If you found one in a London dung heap, a Bartman, would you automatically assume it was a witch bottle and treat it that way?
Yeah.
Well, actually, that segues into my next question, which is, have there been any intentionally destroyed witch bottles found in archaeological contexts, i.e. breaking the magic, breaking the bottle, discarding the pieces with the contents?
Yeah, I mean, there are some which it's really hard. There are some which are found. There's some in the collections of Colchester Museum, and where the bottles have been really kind of completely smashed up and broken, and you've still got the contents still in the base. So whether or not that reflects one of these ones which Owen was talking about, ones which had been exploded, or just merely the fact that when they were found, part of the bottle was broken here, part of the bottle was broken here, or just merely didn't get deposited together, we don't know. But there is no evidence of the ones which Owen was describing where they've been exploded, at all, and none of them display any evidence of being heated as well. And I think maybe our next kind of experiment would be to get one of these bottles replicas made and try one of these Cunning Mural like experiments and heat it up and see what happens. Under completely safe circumstances.
I mean, as long as there's like some form of bulletproof glass,
indeed,
I'm all up for that.
Yeah, but it would be really interesting to sort of heat them and see how long, these things are very impervious. Stoneware is the highest fired ceramics you can make. So to have it a situation where it explodes when you're looking at a domestic fire, domestic fireplace in the 17th century when they're not using coal, they're using wood to get it up to that kind of temperature. Mm-hmm. Definitely a case for experimental archaeology, I feel, coming on here.
I've got another lovely question from somebody who used to work with me. They said that have remains of any been found on graveyard sites in Suffolk? Is it common for them to be found in graveyards or in other ways associated with the dead?
The answer to that is yes. There is one found, and again, you can see how the materiality shifts here. There's one from the 18th century, mid-18th century, which is in glass, which is found in a grave from an excavation in Buckinghamshire somewhere. I can't recall it now. And it's interesting. That's in glass, and it has all of the sort of the elements of a witch bottle. The witch bottle in terms of the contents. The contents is what makes it a witch bottle. So it's got the pins which are broken in, and it's still got the liquid intact. But unfortunately, for conservation reasons, we couldn't open it. And what the interesting thing is that it has the cork with the nails stabbed into it, and that's the first example we've got of that practice. And there are others which are reported, which are in glass, which have been found from graveyards, but there is, but principally from the sort of foundations of churches and so on. But I think that could be mixed up to do with perhaps creations of love magic, or indeed it just because I think there was kind of when Merrifield was still writing, what he was really interested in was, he was very much taken in by the idea of sort of foundation deposits. And I think some witch bottles, which aren't witch bottles, have been recorded as being witch bottles. And I think some of the ones from churches, for example, are examples of that. But that's for all of us to sort of figure out in due course.
There are a few 19th century examples.
Yeah.
Cunning folk advising putting the churchyard. But as Nigel says, in one instance from Cornwall, it was actually a wart charm. In other words, the bottle with urine and things put in it was against warts.
Yeah.
So we've got another one saying more about the inclusions. Have any rowan berries or wood twigs been found in any?
We certainly find thorns inside some witch bottles, so there are organic elements. I guess one of the real challenges for us studying these sorts of things is that whether or not these survive organics will depend on the sort of burial circumstances of the bottles. So organic elements might have been a bit more common than we might expect. The very fact that urine seems to be absolutely prevalent, but that doesn't survive. Perhaps a few more bottles had felt hearts or hair or these bits of plants, but it's quite difficult to say. But yeah, we do have thorns. We do have some element of plants going in there, but it's not a common thing to
what you often find is that the sort of museum will have the account that these things were contained within the bottle at the point that they were found, but often at the point when they either entered the museum collections or, I hate to say it, sometimes subsequently, these things have been lost. Yeah.
Right, so we've got a question, I think, from the US. It would be great if you could explain the difference between witch bottles of England and those found in the US.
Yeah, there are examples of it in the United States as well. They always date from the 18th to 19th century, and they're always in glass. Okay, glass vials and sort of so on. I think the problem with the way that they've been interpreted in the US is probably perhaps a problem in the way that they've been interpreted here. That is, so persuasive is the kind of the narrative of the witch and the narrative perhaps of what Merrifield was initially writing, that people have often sort of and copy and pasted sort of internet histories which are put to do with witch bottles. That American examples have tend to be interpreted in the same way as the English ones are. Of course, we're all the same, right? But it could be the case that the American ones, I think, also need really, really disentangling to think about what they are. I mean, I have had many inquiries from the States, which I've clearly got clear examples of, 18th century practices of, the creation of a so-called witch bottle. But it's always in glass. Again, there's a material shift away necessarily from using these stoneware bottles as well. So yeah, there are ones, but they tend to be interpreted in the kind of more the witchcraft type, perceptions are sort of placed on them.
And maybe that's your next project.
Maybe it's my next project, yeah.
One more very silly question, which amuses me greatly. Is this where the phrase, boils my expletive for urine, comes from?
Don't think so.
There we go. Right then, so I suppose we better close up.
Yeah.
But can you tell us more information about your project? Where should people contact? You obviously have this history pin site as well. Could you explain more?
Gary.
Yeah, so we're pinning examples of found concealed bottles onto History Pin, which is a freely accessible website. So just History Pin and then search for Concealed Revealed. And there's quite a few examples there. And we're welcoming any members of the public to pin their own examples, just kind of copy our template. And please do get in touch. Nigel's already said email or Twitter. We'd love to add more.
The actual proceedings of our research itself, we've published one little article in British Archaeology about it, but the main body of the work is going to be captured in a monograph produced by myself and Michael's workplace, Mola, that will be printed, but also made freely available online as a PDF in due course on the Mola website. And we're moving into our kind of research writing up phase now of the project, in the next month or two, which is really exciting for us. And
I suppose if anybody finds a witch bottle in their house or possibly a dung heap, they should get in contact with you.
Absolutely. We'd love to hear about it, particularly the ones which are found in a dung heap.
So if you've got any more questions, please still use the Witch Bottle Live hashtag, and we will try and personally get back to you throughout the course of this week, I suppose.
It's worth mentioning as well that Owen and Kerry and I were involved in making an animation, which was on BBC Arts on the Cultures in Quarantine website. That's still available till November, in which we worked with a brilliant production company called Calling the Shots to make an animation about witch bottle practice, which is based on a real case of the 1670s and 1680s. And that's a nice little 5-minute animation, which is still available on BBC iPlayer.
Life and Times of a Witch Bottle.
Life and Times of a Witch Bottle, indeed.
It's very sweet, actually. Well, thank you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your questions. It's a goodbye from our brilliant experts.
Goodbye.
And it's a goodbye from me. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.